How to Live in Your Van, Part 1, Insulation. Hello, my name is One Awesome Inch, and today we will be discussing various facets of the insulation of a van. What to use, what to do, what not to do, and maybe even a bit of how to do it. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoy. So you say, One Awesome Inch, why insulate? What's the point? Well, there are a number of different areas to discuss. Number one, to retain heat. Most vans use propane heaters. Most people who live in vans use propane heaters to heat their living space. So if you use a propane heater and you're well insulated, you're going to require less propane to do the same job, which means you'll save money in the long run. Number two, you want to keep out the heat in hot weather. So it's similar to a cooler, you would have the insulation to block out heat and retain the coolness inside. Now there is one major caveat, and that is if you live in an area that is notoriously hot, like say Florida or Texas, insulation is not a good idea because your van will be in the sun all day, and by the time it's evening time, that heat is going to get into the van. So what happens is it actually gets into the insulation, and the insulation retains the heat. So instead of being cool at night, your van is going to be hotter for longer because all the heat is stuck inside the insulation. So in hot areas, it's better not to insulate at all. Thirdly, it's important to insulate for a reason that I think most people kind of miss. And that's because you want to cover any exposed van metal. When it's cold outside and your van, the metal of your van gets cold, it will create problems for you. And the reason is because if you have a heater on inside, like a propane heater, and the warm air touches the cold metal of the van that's cold from the outside, water droplets will form in the form of condensation. And then those water droplets will collect to the point where they will roll down the side of the metal and create problems with moisture. And when that happens, you have a risk of having mold issues, which can be very unhealthy for your body and give you all kinds of lung problems. So in my van, I've covered I intend to cover all van metal, all exposed van metal. You won't see any in my van when it's finished. What kind of material should I use to insulate with? Well, let's talk about a number of different kinds there are. There is the standard fiberglass insulation, the pink stuff that you would see, the fluffy stuff. There is denim insulation. There is wool insulation. I would advise against using those products because they retain moisture, and you kind of want to be prepared for the worst case scenario. If moisture gets into your walls, and which it very well could, water has a way of getting into places, then if that moisture gets into your walls, you are going to have issues with moisture being trapped in there and eventually could cause mold. So it's better not to use those products. Also, regarding fiberglass insulation, it's really not a pleasant product to work with. And it's not only is it not pleasant to work with in terms of touching it, but it's actually quite unhealthy because, as with things like asbestos, those little particles of fiberglass get in the air and you breathe that in, and it's really bad for your lungs. So I recommend not using standard pink fiberglass insulation. Alright, so we've talked about some forms of insulation you probably should avoid using. What should you use? Well, in my opinion, the best thing to use is what you call rigid foam board insulation. Also, there's another kind you can get called polyisocarbonate. So here we have an example of rigid foam board insulation. It's firm, it's beautiful, it's effective. So what I've done here is I've taped all the edges together so that, number one, there's no air gaps for exposing the van to airflow from the outside, which I don't want. And number two, moisture. Moisture won't get through this tape. Now, what about polyisocarbonate? Here is an example of that. This is the silver stuff, and it's got little tiny bubbles in it. Now you may think, well, what's the difference between the two? The difference is this stuff is claimed to be R7, and that is one of the highest levels you can get. The thickness of these ones, if it's a half an inch thick, it's R3. If it's an inch thick, it's R5. Suffice it to say, it's better to use polyisocarbonate whenever you possibly can. So the polyisocarbonate is quite a bit more expensive. The up here in Canada, a sheet of this stuff is $28, and that is for 4 by 8 feet. I can't quite recall what the 1 inch 4 by 8 of foam board is. So here we have my two doors, and you can see that they're both insulated, and I use this tuck tape, which is quite high quality. And as you can see, I have some polyiso down here, and then I have the pink stuff here, and oh look, I got some more up here. You may say, why? Well, the reason is because I had some of this left over and I wanted to use it. So I used as much as I could, and then I had to go buy some of this other stuff. So some people might be curious as to how the foam board is put in place. Basically what I've done is I've just measured the width of the door, and what I have here is, it's pretty tough to see, but I have the 3/4 inch pine right here, and then I have 1/2 inch plywood that's screwed into this pine, and then I have the length of it, and then I have the same thing on the other side. Why I've done that is because that 1/2 inch plywood is what I'm going to be using to attach my my tongue and groove boards. So how I'm attaching this foam board into the door frame is I'm not using any glue, and this tape is basically just here to stop any gaps from being a problem. The only way this foam board is really held in place is by friction. So what I do is I measure it out, and then I just cut it slightly too big, like maybe by 1 millimeter or 2, and then I just push it in, and there she goes. And once I put the I got a piece right here, this tongue and groove, I'll put it from the floor all the way up to the top of the door, and that will keep it in place, no problem. To summarize, insulation is very important. Not only will it keep you warm, but it will decrease the noise from outside. The most important part of insulation to me is not necessarily keeping you warm. It's the idea that you want to make sure that there's no exposed van metal. Because like I mentioned, if there's exposed van metal and warm air from inside your van hits that cold van metal that's being cooled from the outside, you will get water droplets forming in terms of condensation, and that will create problems for you. So that's more important to stop that than anything. Heat, you can just always turn up the heat or whatever, but you can't stop those water droplets from forming without insulation. So we have come to the end of How to Live in Your Van, Part 1, Insulation. I hope that I have managed to strike your curiosity and inform you somewhat, I would encourage you to look further into this subject if you intend to live in a van, as insulation is, to me, critical. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great night.